All right. Welcome back. We did talk about villains, but you know what I love? A good hero. And let's just jump into one of my favorite mediums, comic books. I want to talk about the history of comic books, which can perhaps span centuries. So let's start way back at the potential beginning. There are three distinct modern traditions of comics, and these are usually seen as the European, American, and Japanese traditions. And they've all followed very different paths. Before we jump in, let's just make sure we're on the same page about a comic. It's a medium used to express ideas with images, often combined with text or other visual information, typically taking the form of a sequence of panels of images with textual devices such as speech balloons, captions, and onomatopoeia, right? Sounds like click, clack, psh, punch, etc., indicating dialogue, narration, sound effects, or other sorts of information. There's no consensus on this definition, but this is what we're going to work with for today. By that definition, some scholars have posited prehistory, with the cave paintings of France being the very genesis of what we've seen today as comic books. So super interesting. If we then follow the history of sequential art, obviously we can look at Egyptian hieroglyphs, Greek friezes, Rome's columns, Mayan script, medieval tapestries, and illustrated Christian manuscripts. It took the invention of the modern printing techniques to bring the form to a wider audience and become a mass medium. The earliest printed material concentrated on religious subjects, with densely illustrated versions of the Bible as a widely distributed medium that combined many images with text in order to bring the teachings of Christianity to the illiterate masses. Perhaps one of the earliest examples of this is in the late 1400s, where the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch created several paintings with sequential narratives which can be considered prototypical comics, such as The Seven Deadly Sins, The Death and the Miser, and The Garden of Earthly Delights. Over the following centuries, several Europeans started creating sequential series of art, and they evolved from everything from politics, Christianity, and satire. Now, manga, which is, as of today, the largest comic book / graphic novel industry in the world, has a stronger, longer tradition. It's said to have originated from emakimono scrolls dating back to the 12th and 13th centuries. During the Edo period, the 1603 to 1867, books of drawings embedded the concept of manga, which first came into common usage in the late 18th centuries. Now, of course, manga did change considerably after the American occupation, post-World War II, but it's fascinating to see that perhaps even before the Europeans were creating what became modern-day comic books, Japan might have beat them in terms of date. Japanese comic books might be the first true modern-day precursors to what we read today. As you can see, it's difficult to nail down when exactly comic books started, except if we're really looking at the last, probably, century. The Glasgow Looking Glass, published in 1826, was arguably one of the first comic magazines. Rodolphe Töpfer, I hope I'm saying that right, at the time, was a Francophone Swiss artist who was a key figure in developing these sequentially illustrated stories. And this was marked by the proliferation of satirical drawings, which gained a name, cartoons. In 1867, British humor magazine Judy released the first weekly comic to feature a regular character, so the first serialized comic for a mass audience, which was Ali Sloper's Half Holiday. The magazine was extremely popular with the working class and had a circulation as high as 350,000 readers. I know we're going through a lot of history relatively quickly, but I wanted to show the distinction between kind of more ancient history, where pictures were used to tell stories but didn't really follow what we kind of identify as modern comic books, and this proto-comic book era in which, we're seeing satire and certain kinds of cartoons that are becoming serialized and more available to the masses, which is an important feature of what became modern-day comic books. Shortly thereafter, in 1900, it saw the debut of the Jiji manga in the Jiji Shimpo newspaper, which was the first use of the word manga in its modern sense. And 2 years later, Rakuten Kitazawa became the first modern Japanese comic strip. So comic strips are generally short, multi-panel comics that have most commonly appeared in newspapers, and daily strips have normally occupied a single tier, while Sunday strips have been given multiple tiers, with the former being printed in black and white and the Sunday comics typically being printed in color and often occupying a full page. Now, specialized comic periodical formats vary greatly in different cultures. American comics are thin periodicals usually published in color, whereas European and Japanese comics are frequently serialized in magazines, monthly or weekly, and usually are in black and white. They can be collected in volumes, such as graphic novels, or tankobon in Japan following magazine serialization. Webcomics today are super prevalent on the internet, first being published in the 1980s. They are able to potentially reach large audiences, and new readers can often access archives of previous installments. Some consider storyboards and wordless novels to be comics as well. Okay, let's talk about the American market, which was significant and super influential in the history of comic books. So the first age that historians really identify is the Victorian age of comics, which typically lasts from 1842 to 1897. Now, the comics at this time in the United States originated in the early European works. In 1842, the work Histoire de Mr. Vieux-Bois by Rodolphe Töpfer, who was mentioned earlier, was published under the titles of The Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck in the United States. It follows a man who goes through a bunch of trials and tribulations to find the love of his life. Now, this comic was reprinted regularly into the late 1870s, so for about 3 decades, which gave American artists the idea to produce similar works. In 1849, Journey to the Gold Diggins by Jeremiah Saddlebags by James A. and Donald F. Reed was the first American comic. Political satire continued to be an important development in the establishment of sequential art. Enlightenment and Revolution Europe had tons of these kind of work present, and it soon found its way into American literature. And while in the beginning, these magazines only reached an audience educated and rich enough to afford them, technological progress allowed easy and cheap reproduction of images for the American comic to take off. So media moguls like Joseph Pulitzer, who's the namesake of the Pulitzer Prize, engaged in fierce competition with other moguls to attract readers and decided to publish cartoons in their newspapers. This was followed by the Platinum Age, so 1897 to 1938, which was characterized by a gradual introduction of the key elements of American mass comics. So first off, the funnies were found in the humor pages of the newspapers. They were published in the Sunday edition to retain readership. These included the first drawings of humanized animals in the series Little Bears and Tykes. In 1894, Joseph Pulitzer published in the New York World the first color strip designed by Walt McDougall, showing that the technique already enabled this kind of publications. Now, these two eras are important, but they also miss a lot of the key elements of which we can trace comic books today. And I do want to bring attention to the pulp magazines, the pulps, which were inexpensive fiction magazines published from around 1896 to around 1955. The term actually derives from the cheap wood pulp paper in which the magazines were printed, and they typically had 128 pages, around 7 inches wide by 10 inches high, and about half an inch thick. They were successors to earlier serial literature such as the Penny Dreadfuls, which were published in the United Kingdom and featured characters like Sweeney Todd, a murderous barber who killed his victims with a razor and then gave their bodies to his accomplice who baked pies with them. Yes, very morbid. Dick Turpin, who was an actual English highwayman whose exploits were romanticized following his execution in New York for horse theft. The urban myth at the time in Victorian era England of Spring-Heeled Jack, the Monster, and Robin Hood. Now, Penny Dreadfuls slowly and surely fell out of style just because of the quality of literature and competing works such as pulp fiction. And although many respected writers wrote for pulps, the magazines were best known for their lurid, exploitative, and sensational subject matter, and thus are considered the ancestors of modern-day superhero comic books. Pulp magazines often featured illustrated novel-length stories of heroic characters such as Flash Gordon, an American hero who adventures in space, the Shadow, a mysterious vigilante who claims he was once a famed aviator who fought for the French during World War I, and then found a new challenge in waging war on criminals by traveling across the world and learning many skills to frighten and terrify them. He's also a wealthy playboy, if you can start to put together the pieces of how this character could have influenced future characters. The Man of Bronze, Doc Savage, who is a polymath. He's a scientist, explorer, detective, and soldier who, quote, rights wrongs and punishes evil doers. He sold over 20 million copies. And other famous literary characters such as Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, Zorro, Conan the Barbarian, and John Carter of Mars. All characters that we know and love today. I would be remiss if I didn't mention The Phantom, an American adventure comic strip published by Lee Falk, who is an alum of the University of Illinois. The main character, the Phantom, or the Ghost Who Walks, is a costumed crime fighter who operates from a jungle country. He was the first fictional hero to wear the skin-tight costume, which became a hallmark of comic book superheroes, and was the first shown in a mask with no visible pupils, another superhero standard. He's considered a transitional figure since the Phantom has some of the characteristics of Pulp magazine heroes, such as the Shadow and the Spider, and earlier jungle heroes such as Tarzan, but preceding and anticipating the features of heroes such as Superman, Batman, and Captain America. It started in 1936 and is still running. It's been read by over 100 million people, which calls to mind the comic strip Prince Valiant in the Days of King Arthur, which started in 1937 and is still running. So I know for the general public, a lot of our cultural consciousness is dominated by DC and Marvel comics, but there's a ton of stuff out there that predates both of them and still exists. The word superhero itself dates back to 1899, and the predecessors of this archetype include mythological characters such as Gilgamesh, Hanuman, Odysseus, David, and Heracles, as well as folkloric heroes such as Robin Hood, who adventured in distinctive clothing. Real-life inspiration behind costume superheroes can be traced back to the masked vigilantes of the American Old West, such as the San Diego Vigilantes, who fought and killed outlaws while wearing masks. In 1903, the British play The Scarlet Pimpernel popularized the idea of a masked avenger and the superhero trope of a secret identity. 1929 featured Popeye the Sailor Man, another precursor of the modern superhero. There were various novels at the time, such as King Solomon's Mines, The War of the Worlds, Tom Sawyer, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Invisible Man, and many more of these stories which incorporated elements of science fiction and adventure, which again can be seen as precursors of what today are modern-day comic books. These particular characters are rounded up together in a graphic novel called The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is pretty neat to see all these characters, which kind of existed in Victorian age in England, come together and fight threats, which is pretty neat. Okay, April 18th, 1938, the date in which all of you will tell me that the golden age of comic books started. Yes, there were heroes before. Yes, there were heroes with secret identities before. Yes, there were heroes with superpowers before. But this was the debut of the prototypical superhero, Superman. Published in Action Comics #1 by Detective Comics, the predecessor of DC Comics, which led rival companies to create superheroes of their own to emulate Superman's success, and his popularity helped to make comic books a major arm of publishing. Batman, Green Lantern, The Flash, the Hawkman, Aquaman, and Green Arrow all debuted shortly after. Since it was World War II, patriotic heroes, especially those dressed in red, white, and blue, did extremely well. So we saw Captain America and Wonder Woman fighting the Nazis quite a bit. Now, this era wasn't fully disassociated from the eras that preceded it, so comic strips such as The Spirit, written by Will Eisner, featured a Pulp Fiction-esque hero who is a private investigator and criminologist who solves crimes at the street level without any superpowers. Timely Comics, which is the precursor of the modern-day Marvel Comics, had two other heroes besides Captain America which were incredibly popular. One was the Human Torch, who is an android created by a scientist who possessed the ability to surround himself with fire and control flames. And he's mostly kind of faded into obscurity. I think he's involved with the Fantastic Four in modern days, but he was way more popular during the Golden Age. And Namor, the Submariner, who was most recently seen in Wakanda Forever, the sequel to Black Panther, as the ruler of Atlantis, or in the modern rendition, Talokan. Namor was important because he was perhaps the first example of a true anti-hero in comic books. In fact, in his first appearance, he's actually presented as an enemy of the United States. But his viewpoint, especially as the sovereign of the underwater kingdoms, was designed to be showcased in a way that induced empathy among readership. So pretty neat. The first superhero team was actually assembled during this era, which was the Justice Society of America, the JSA. And the original members were pretty obscure in modern era, but if you're a true comic book nerd like me, you'll know them. It's Dr. Fate, Hourman, the Spectre, Sandman, the Atom, the Flash, Green Lantern, and Hawkman. Despite all the wartime propaganda and the sheer explosion of these superheroes, do you know who the most popular character was of the era? It was actually from Fawcett Comics. It was Captain Marvel, who's today known as Shazam. And I'll tell you why. He regularly sold about 1.4 million copies per issue, which were sometimes published bi-weekly. So he's more popular than Captain America, than Wonder Woman, than Superman. It's because it's very simple. The character, Billy Batson, is an 8-year-old boy who, when he says the word Shazam, is struck by lightning and gains superpowers. You can see why this resonated with young readers. Two other important developments during this period included the addition of supervillains, such as the Joker, and sidekicks, such as Robin, which, again, seemed as a conduit for young readers to identify with these stories. For the 10 years after World War II, there was the atomic age of comic books. It was an intermediary period, and during this time, the popularity of superhero comics waned significantly, and comic publishers diversified into other genres such as war, westerns, science fiction, romance, crime, and horror. This moves us into the Silver Age of comic books from 1956 to 1970. During this time period in Japan, the manga Astro Boy became super popular. It focused on a robot boy built by a scientist to replace his deceased son, and originally intended for military purposes, Astro Boy possessed amazing powers such as flight through thrusters in his feet and incredible mechanical strength. There was a shift in Japanese popular culture at the time towards tokusatsu, masked superheroes over kaiju, giant monsters like Godzilla. Female heroes, or imitations of their male counterparts, became pretty popular. Like, this is when we started seeing Batwoman, the first Batgirl, and Supergirl. Most superhero supergroups typically had a token female, right? The Justice League of America had Wonder Woman, the Fantastic Four had Invisible Girl, and the X-Men had Jean Grey. Crossovers, both intra-company and inter-company, became super popular because, why focus on one hero? We can just get a bunch of them together, right? That's what's happening right now with all these cinematic universes. So the initial Justice League lineup included 7 of DC Comics superheroes who were regularly published at the time. This was Aquaman, The Flash, Green Lantern, The Martian Manhunter, and Wonder Woman. In addition, Superman and Batman were part of this group as well. But they were largely absent from the early stories because they also had their own titles and were starring together in DC's World's Finest Comics. And authors were worried the 2 more famous heroes would attract attention from their less popular teammates. However, as the series went on, Superman and Batman were so popular, it became more and more present, and today I doubt there's any major Justice League story without the 2 involved. The roster would quickly expand with the Green Arrow, the Atom, and Hawkman, heroes from the Golden Age, adapted to the Silver Age. The X-Men debuted in 1963, and just to give some context into what was happening in America at the time was the Civil Rights Movement. And so mutants are the focus of these stories. They're humans who are born with a genetic trait called the X gene, which grants them natural superhuman abilities, generally manifesting throughout puberty. So due to their differences from the majority of humanity, mutants are subject to prejudice and discrimination, and many X-Men stories feature social commentary on bigotry, justice, and other political themes. Very much an allegory towards the racism and prejudice that was happening in the real world. The original team comprised of Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Beast, Angel, and Iceman. And again, another parallel to the real world is a lot of people align the views of Professor X with Martin Luther King. and his nemesis and friend, Magneto, is often aligned with Malcolm X. This is a landmark and very popular comic book series because the conflict between mutants and Homo sapiens is often compared to real-world conflicts experienced by minority groups, various religious or non-religious groups, ethnic minorities, autistic individuals, the LGBT community, and more. The X-Men are hated, feared, and despised collectively by humanity for no other reason than that they are mutants, which is what Uncanny X-Men writer Chris Claremont wrote. Magneto himself is a Jewish Holocaust survivor who saw the situation of mutants as similar to those of Jews in Nazi Germany, and the title was remarkably diverse. Like, we looked at all these folks that we just mentioned. Most of these characters are undeniably white and men. Even the aliens and other creatures, right? The Atlanteans, the Kryptonians, they're all white. X-Men are super diverse, like everywhere from Kenya to India, all kinds of religions from Hindu to Catholic, and all kinds of interests, backgrounds, and relationships. It's super cool, and it makes sense why they were so popular. They appealed to a really wide audience. One more team that I have to mention are the Avengers, which debuted in 1963, originally consisting of Iron Man, Ant-Man, Hulk, Thor, and the Wasp, their token female member. Captain America was discovered trapped in ice in issue number 4 and joined the group right after that. So they were distinctly separate from the X-Men. Those characters were created specifically to be part of the team, and the group being central to their identity. The Avengers, in contrast, were created to cross-promote different independent characters, right? So Iron Man and Thor were both very popular in their own right, but a reader of Iron Man might buy an Avengers book and develop an interest in Thor through that book. Great creators of the time included Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, who co-created iconic characters such as Spider-Man, the aforementioned X-Men, Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, Ant-Man, the Wasp, the Fantastic Four, and of course Black Panther, Daredevil, Doctor Strange, the Scarlet Witch, and Black Widow. They challenged the Comics Code Authority, which was formed in 1954 by the Comics Magazine Association of America, as an alternative to government regulation. The code was essentially censorship as a response to widespread public concern over graphic violence presented in comic books. So it had some interesting criteria, right? Crimes shall never be presented in such a way to create sympathy for the criminal. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in a way to create disrespect. All scenes of excessive bloodshed, gore, or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism shall not be permitted. No comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title. All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations should be eliminated. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil. If crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity. Scenes dealing with Walking Dead, vampires are prohibited. Profanity, obscenity, vulgarity are all forbidden. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. No nudity, no suggestive or salacious illustration, no sex relations. Like, I can see where they're coming from. And comics kind of stalled during the beginning of this era. Superman comics were in great quantity, but little quality. Batman and Robin comics were lackluster in comparison to their earlier adventures. Wonder Woman had lost her original writer and artist, and Aquaman and Green Arrow were just backup features. The real change here happened when October 1856 showcased the modern version of the Flash, and the cover had the Flash running so fast that he had escaped from the frame. Characters often gained successors as they modified themselves to this age. So, for example, the Golden Age Green Lantern, which was railroad engineer Alan Scott, possessed a ring powered by a magical lantern, but his Silver Age replacement, or successor, test pilot Hal Jordan, had a ring powered by an alien battery and created by an intergalactic police force, which is the Green Lantern Corps. Magic and gods were now replaced by science and aliens. It's typically said to have ended in the early 1970s. A good gauge here is the death of Gwen Stacy, the girlfriend of Peter Parker, in 1973, when the era of innocence was ended by the snap of her neck heard around the comic book world. It was a sick, startling event that shocked all Spider-Man readers. It was a symbolic ending to the innocence and can-do optimism of the Silver Age, of which also the Green Lantern was a very good example of. Like in the 60s, he was very optimistic, but by 1972, the Green Lantern had become world-weary, with the character saying in one story, quote, "Those days are gone forever. The days I was confident, certain, I was so young, so sure I couldn't make a mistake. Young and cocky, that was Green Lantern. Well, I've changed. I'm older now, maybe wiser too, and a lot less happy." So now we entered the Bronze Era of comics, if you're still with me, and this was focused on a little bit of more groundedness and realism, such as taking down Superman's powers and focusing on ground-level stories of characters like Green Arrow and Green Lantern teaming up. Topics such as drug abuse and urban poverty were discussed in depth for the first time here in comic books. Green Lantern's sidekick, Speedy, is revealed to be a junkie, which was pretty shocking. And there was also a growth in supernatural and horror-oriented titles such as The Swamp Thing, The Ghost Rider, and Dracula. So, given the nature of their audience, comic book stories since the beginning dealt with social issues. Superman stories in the beginning dealt with child mistreatment and working conditions for minors. However, in the 70s, relevance not only just became a feature, but it also became something that books loudly proclaimed on their cover to promote sales. Racism, environmental degradation, alcoholism, all these things were actually fairly commonly discussed. Art became more realistic, minority characters became more prominent, female characters were given up more empowerment, and team-up books and anthologies became very common. This brings us to the modern age of comic books, which is slightly ill-defined because there are still some distinctions between the years that have happened since 1985 to now, obviously, and I'll try to follow these scholarly interpretations of the different eras here. This was when Marvel's Secret Wars, a storyline featuring the company's most prolific superheroes, and Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was DC Comics' first large-scale crossover, and now, geez, they just do crises all the time. This crisis was notable because we had the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age. It was getting very confusing because there were multiple writers creating new characters, new storylines for all these characters, and everything was getting messed up. This storyline synthesized all the different universes, all the different storylines, and essentially gave a hard reboot, a hard reset to the DC Universe continuity. It's essentially the cheat code for retconning and revamping histories, especially when it gets too complex, because comic book storylines typically go on forever and ever. So the first era of the modern era, so the sub-era, I guess, would be the Dark Age, which is circa 1985 to 2004. One of the most famous comics here was by writer Alan Moore, who wrote Watchmen, which was used as a means of reflecting contemporary anxieties, of deconstructing and satirizing the superhero concept, and to make political commentary. It depicts an alternative history in which superheroes emerged in the 40s and 60s, kind of like how they did in real life, and their presence changed history so that the United States won the Vietnam War, and the Watergate scandal was never exposed. In 1985, when the book takes place, the country is actually edging towards World War III with the Soviet Union, with most freelance vigilantes having been outlawed. So the story focuses on the protagonist's personal development and moral struggles as an investigation into the murder of a government-sponsored superhero pulls him out of retirement. Yeah, it's some heavy stuff, and it's considered one of the greatest graphic novels of all time. Frank Miller was prolific in this era for writing Batman Year One, which would become one of the most popular Batman stories ever published, and revamped several key aspects of his first year on the job. Of course, following this was The Dark Knight Returns, which is perhaps one of the most influential and famous or infamous Batman comics of all time. It features a 55-year-old Bruce Wayne coming out of retirement to take Gotham back from gangs and criminals and features his final showdowns with characters such as the Joker, Harvey Dent, and Superman. It's dark stuff. Like, he almost dies. There's a lot of times in which he's commenting very cynical things, and the overall artistry of the work is kind of disturbing, dark, and very vivid in terms of the crimes being portrayed. So things got dark, seriously. Wolverine, the Punisher, Frank Miller's version of the Daredevil all challenged the previous model of a cheerful humanitarian. Some of them stretched the conventional boundary between villain and hero. Some of these heroes were actively killing criminals during their exploits. More violence prevailed. There was the violence-loving Lobo, who's an intergalactic bounty hunter. His comic series was filled with graphic violence. John Constantine, who's more in the supernatural realm, also dealt with pretty adult themes. And then we saw some really violent villains, such as the Joker, who became a mentally ill psychopath rather than just an evil criminal, and did some awful things during this time, such as murdering the second Robin and sexually assaulting and crippling the Batgirl. So things became much more realistic, much more cruel. Green Lantern Hal Jordan became consumed by a parasite called Parallax and became a villain, destroying his entire home city of Coast City and the entire Green Lantern Corps. So he actually became a straight-on supervillain. Batman was crippled by Bane in the story arc Nightfall, and Superman was killed by the unstoppable Doomsday in October 1993. It was a pretty nuts era, and some of these comics still have repercussions today. So following this, I think we can really get into the true modern age, which is 2004 through around 2011, so right before the Avengers movie came out, and this was the work of reconstruction, defining the superhero no longer by his or her acts of heroism or moral code, but rather as one out of a plethora of protagonists in a publisher-wide meta-story existing across numerous titles and events. And I think this is where part of the problem with modern-day comics arises. There's just so many different things happening all the time. It's very hard to keep a hold of it, a track of it. Yes, if we look to the ancient mythologies of the Greeks and the Hindus, there are grand epics which are connected, right? The Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. But it is complex right now to figure out what's going on in comic books, at least for me. So during this era, there was stuff like Civil War, which you guys probably know what's going on. At DC, there were many more crises, some great Batman comics, some great overall story arcs. But it's almost like the proliferation of technology. You know, technology is expanding at an exponential rate. I feel like the rate of comics and crossovers and crises are just multiplying so quickly. Even me, as a longtime comic book fan, is finding it difficult. And I think that's where we are. Post-2011, we can call this the post-modern age of comics. These are marked by very distinct characters who have taken on established legacies and mantles, like Miles Morales, who is distinctly different than Peter Parker, and Terry McGinnis, who's distinctly different than Bruce Wayne. I have to give a shout out to the YouTubers who've helped me do research for this, Comics Historian and Comics Explained. It's not only the easiest way to keep up with what's going on in the comic world, aside from Variant Comics channel, but it's also the only way that I know, because if I were going to name one final age, it would be that we are in the plastic age, because comics are pretty and shiny from a distance, but up close, they can be stale and mass-produced with varying degrees of toxicity, and it never seems to end. Okay, rant over. See you guys in the next one.